"Shut your damn mouth." It wasn't just an insult, it was a warning, spit from Donald Trump across the hearing room. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She came holding a single yellowed letter, tied to 23 hours before Jeffrey Epstein's death, 14 survivors silenced, 47 sealed case files, and $138 million moved offshore without a single vote in Congress. In that moment, the marble chamber wasn't just a room, it was a vault about to burst. And when she placed that letter on the table, the smirk on Trump's face lasted exactly 9 seconds. Before the entire country realized this hearing was no longer about politics, it was about who survives when the powerful decide who disappears. No gavel struck, no formal announcement, just a stillness so heavy it pressed against the ribs of everyone in the chamber. From the far end of the marble floor, Jasmine Crockett emerged, not storming, not striding for show, but moving with the slow inevitability of a verdict. Her silhouette stretched long under the vaulted lights, a thin blade of shadow cutting through the static air. In her left hand, a single yellowed envelope, edges curled and bruised, as though they'd been clenched in a fist for years. The right hand swung loosely at her side, fingers barely grazing the seam of her suit jacket, betraying no tremor. The media lenses tracked her like predators, following something they didn't yet understand, but knew might change the night's hunt. Donald J. Trump sat at the witness table, shoulders squared, arms folded across his chest like he was defending a crown. A red tie knotted so tight it seemed to cut into his skin. His smirk was already there, painted on with the confidence of a man who'd spent decades learning how to own a room. But this time, it had an edge, like a gambler flashing teeth before the cards hit the table, betting the other player was bluffing. His lawyers flanked him on either side, murmuring something low, but he wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on Jasmine, unblinking, like he believed that if he stared hard enough, he could make her falter before she spoke. She didn't look at him yet. The marble floor caught the sharp click of her heels, each step the same measured distance apart, like a metronome counting down to something only she knew was coming. The committee members shifted in their seats, some straightening jackets, others tugging at papers they had no intention of reading. The crowd behind the brass rail leaned forward unconsciously, their bodies inching toward the tension as if proximity might let them feel the heat more clearly. Jasmine reached her seat but didn't sit. She placed the envelope on the polished wood, deliberately, almost tenderly, as though setting down a relic rescued from fire. For 9 seconds, the chamber forgot to breathe. The camera zoomed so close you could see the faint dust along the envelope's fold, the watermark of years spent in darkness, the faint outline of something inside pressed just shy of breaking through. 9 seconds in which the entire arc of power in that room shifted, subtle at first, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice that the balance no longer leaned toward the man in the red tie. Trump's smirk cracked then, a hairline fracture across a mask that had weathered depositions, bankruptcies, scandals, and stage lights. It wasn't obvious unless you were watching for it, but Jasmine was. Her eyes flicked up for the first time, meeting his across the space, and in that silent exchange, there was no question of bluffing. Only inevitability. Chairman Roland Vance cleared his throat, the sound bouncing awkwardly against the walls like a cough in a cathedral. His voice was steady but lacked its usual steel. This hearing will come to order. It felt less like authority and more like a plea, to restore normalcy, to rein in the moment before it slipped beyond the control of procedural rules. But normalcy was already gone. Jasmine reached for the envelope again, her fingers resting on its surface with the ease of someone holding a truth that could burn through lies like acid through paper. She didn't rush. The pause itself was an act of control, drawing every gaze toward her hand until it was the only thing moving in the room. Then she slid the envelope open, not with the theatrical rip of a performer, but with the slow, precise care of an archivist handling a piece of history. The paper inside was the color of old bone, creased deep through the center, edges frayed from being handled too many times. Even before she unfolded it, the ink had bled faintly through in places, enough for the dark curves of a signature to ghost against the surface. She laid it flat on the table, smoothed it once with her palm, and the cameras caught the name in full. Jeffrey Edward Epstein. A murmur rippled through the chamber, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that tightens, like air being pulled through a straw. Somewhere in the back, a pen clattered to the floor. One of Trump's attorneys leaned toward him, whispered something fast and urgent. The microphone on the desk picked it up. Two words, almost inaudible. "She's bluffing." Jasmine didn't look up from the page. Her voice came steady, low, and deliberate. "I don't bluff," she said. Then after the briefest pause, she lifted her gaze and finished. "I prepare." The words hung there, anchored in the stillness, daring anyone to move. She slid the letter closer to the center of the table so that the committee could see it, but kept one fingertip resting on the top corner as if to remind them, and him, that control hadn't shifted by accident. The camera closest to her zoomed in, catching the upper right-hand corner of the page. One word was scrawled there, faint but unmistakable: insurance. Trump's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. The red tie seemed tighter now. A single bead of sweat traced down from his temple, catching in the crease above his cheek. Across the aisle, a Fox News anchor watching from the press pit mouthed, "Oh my God." Jasmine's eyes stayed locked on Trump's as she spoke again, the timbre of her voice sharper now. "He didn't write this to save himself. He wrote it to bury someone else." The weight of the sentence hit the room in silence. It was the kind of truth that didn't need volume to echo. It simply lodged itself in the chest and stayed there. She let go of the letter and stepped back half an inch, enough to signal that the floor was hers now, whether the chairman liked it or not. 9 seconds had passed since she'd set that envelope down, and in those 9 seconds the smirk had gone, the posture had shifted, and the first crack in the armor had spread. Outside the chamber, the crowd that had been gathering since dawn shifted too, their chants low and rhythmic, like a tide just beginning to rise. Inside, every camera stayed trained on that piece of paper, the one that had just turned a political hearing into a fight for survival. And Jasmine Crockett, without raising her voice, had made sure everyone in America knew which side she was standing on. The envelope still lay on the table between them, an unassuming rectangle of paper and ink, yet heavy enough to tilt the balance of the entire chamber. She didn't reach for a binder, didn't shuffle through a thick stack of briefs like a lawyer drowning in exhibits. There was no laptop, no prepared slideshow, no army of aides leaning in to whisper bullet points. All she had was the truth and the will to deliver it, and both of those fit perfectly in the palm of her hand. Her heels struck the floor in steady, deliberate intervals, each click ricocheting off the marble like a countdown that everyone could hear, but no one could stop. Every head turned as she moved, some out of curiosity, some out of dread, but none out of indifference. The air in the chamber felt stretched tight, as though the walls themselves were leaning forward to listen. Donald Trump sat exactly where he had been, arms crossed over his chest like a fighter waiting for the opening bell. His chin lifted slightly, a gesture meant to project unshakable control, but his eyes betrayed him. They never left her. It was not the casual glance of a man pretending to be unaffected. It was the locked focus of someone who knew that in a matter of minutes, the ground beneath him could change shape. For a moment, their gaze held across the polished wood of the table, hers steady, unwavering, his a practiced performance that had begun to fray at the edges. He knew, as she knew, that only one of them would walk out of this room with the upper hand. Jasmine reached her spot at the center of the room and stopped. Not to rest, but to plant herself. Her posture was straight, not stiff, her shoulders square, and her chin set at an angle that said she was not here to ask permission to speak. The committee members shifted in their chairs, a few stealing glances at each other as if silently debating whether they were witnessing the start of testimony or the start of a trial in all but name. Even the journalists, those seasoned professionals who had seen political careers implode in real time, seemed to forget the clatter of their keyboards. They were waiting for her to move, to speak, to do something that would break the tension. But she didn't move immediately. She let the moment breathe, let the stillness deepen until it was almost unbearable. Only then did she place her fingertips lightly on the table, her nails tapping once, twice, the way a judge might tap a gavel before delivering a sentence. No flourish, no wasted motion. Just the precision of someone who understood that in rooms like this, power wasn't in the noise you made, but in the silence you could command. Trump's right hand shifted, just a fraction, from the crook of his left arm to the edge of the table, as though readying himself to push forward. The movement was small enough that the casual observer might have missed it, but Jasmine didn't. Her eyes flickered to it, not with fear, but with calculation, as if taking note of an opponent's tell in the middle of a long, dangerous game. She stepped forward half a pace, and the microphones picked up the faint rustle of fabric, a whisper of sound in an otherwise soundless room. She began to speak, and her voice didn't rise or crack. It came out even, steady, the tone of someone who has no need to convince herself of what she's saying. Each word was measured, weighted, landing with the gravity of a hammer blow without the volume of one. The more she spoke, the more the tension in the room shifted from curiosity to something closer to inevitability. This wasn't theater. This wasn't for the cameras, though they captured every angle. This was a dismantling brick by brick in real time. Behind Trump, one of his attorneys leaned in again, muttering something sharp enough to crease his forehead. He didn't look away from Jasmine to respond. Whatever warning or advice was being offered was irrelevant to the moment at hand. His attention stayed locked on her, like a man bracing for an incoming wave he wasn't sure he could outswim. Jasmine's heels clicked once more as she took another deliberate step, the sound punctuating her words like an exclamation mark. The envelope, still lying in plain view, seemed to pulse in the periphery of everyone's vision. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was the embodiment of every unasked question, every buried fact, every ghost that had been locked away in the shadows of privilege and power. And she was about to turn the key. The clock on the wall ticked, though no one seemed to register the passage of time. Outside, the muted chant of the crowd seeped faintly through the glass, a reminder that this moment did not exist in a vacuum. Every syllable spoken here would ripple outward, picked apart in living rooms, replayed on late-night broadcasts, dissected on morning talk shows. The stakes were not abstract. They were national, and they were personal. Trump's breathing had changed, slightly heavier now, as though the air in the room had thickened. His smirk, once broad and careless, had tightened into something more defensive. Jasmine caught it, and for the first time, allowed herself the faintest curve of a smile, not of triumph, but of recognition. This was the shift she had been waiting for, the first visible crack in the performance. She didn't exploit it immediately. She let it sit, let him feel it, let the cameras capture the subtle change. Then, with the same precision she had carried since walking into the room, she reached toward the envelope and slid it closer to herself. Not to hide it, but to remind everyone whose possession it was in. Her eyes swept the committee, the press, and finally landed back on him. When she spoke again, her tone sharpened but never lost its composure. She described the provenance of the letter, how it had been locked away, sealed under orders that bypassed even the Department of Justice's own protocols. She laid out dates, times, the narrow window in which events had unfolded. 23 hours before Epstein's death, 14 survivors silenced, 47 sealed files never reviewed in open court. Each number was a nail, each detail a hammer strike, and with every strike, the structure of the story he had built around himself began to shudder. By the time she paused, the silence was no longer tense. It was charged. Something had shifted in the room, in the posture of the people inside it, in the very air they breathed. And Jasmine Crockett, standing there with nothing but a yellowed envelope and the truth it contained, was no longer just a participant in this hearing. She was the gravity pulling everything toward a point where pretense would no longer hold. The envelope sat in front of her like a detonator, and everyone in that chamber knew the blast radius would be wider than the marble walls could contain. Slowly, with the kind of care usually reserved for handling a relic or a wound, she eased the flap open. A faint rasp of paper against paper filled the air, magnified in the stillness, and the cameras leaned closer in unison, their lenses like unblinking eyes. Her fingers slipped inside and drew out a single sheet, its surface the yellow of old parchment, edges torn as if pried from a folder not meant to be opened. She unfolded it with precision, no wasted motion, her palm smoothing the crease once, twice. The ink had bled faintly into the fibers over time, the loops of the handwriting uneven, betraying the tremor of a man who knew his hours were numbered. And then there it was, pressed stark against the faded page, Jeffrey Edward Epstein. The name landed in the room like a cold wave breaking against stone. No surprise to hear it, but a shock to see it, tangible, undeniable. From somewhere 2 seats behind Trump, a muffled voice hissed, "She's bluffing." The microphone nearest to him caught it, feeding it to the speakers with surgical clarity. The words slipped into the air like a taunt meant for an ally but overheard by the jury. Jasmine's head lifted. Her gaze snapped toward the source of the whisper, then past it, locking squarely on Trump. No theatrics, no smirk. Just that quiet, unblinking stare of someone who knew the exact weight of what she held. "I don't bluff," she said, each syllable landing with a low, deliberate force. Then, letting the silence coil tighter, she added, "I prepare." The last 2 words weren't loud, but they cut through the air like the edge of a blade just barely grazing skin, enough to let everyone know it could go deeper if she chose. Trump's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The smirk that had clung to his face earlier was gone now, replaced by something harder to read, a stillness that felt less like control and more like calculation under pressure. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. She turned the letter slightly so the committee could see it, her fingertips resting on the top edge as if anchoring it in place. The top right corner bore a single word, scrawled smaller than the rest, almost an afterthought. But it was the kind of afterthought that could split an entire defense strategy in two. Insurance. It wasn't underlined, but it didn't need to be. The word itself hummed with implication. The reaction was immediate and uneven. A senator on the far left side leaned forward until his chair creaked. One of the younger aides in the corner froze mid-keystroke. Across the press gallery, a Fox News anchor's lips shaped a silent, "Oh my God," though her camera was still live. The air seemed to thicken around the table, pulling everyone's attention into a single point. Jasmine's hand holding that letter steady. She began to speak again, not to accuse, but to lay the foundation brick by brick. "This document was never reviewed by the Department of Justice," she said evenly. "It was found among Epstein's personal effects, confiscated, sealed, and marked 'Do not release without federal authorization.'" Her voice didn't waver, didn't rush. She was dismantling the safe around this letter in real time for the entire country to watch. It was never supposed to surface, and yet, her eyes flicked back to Trump. Here we are. Trump's hands shifted in his lap, curling into loose fists before relaxing again. He leaned slightly forward but said nothing. The cameras caught the subtle change in his breathing, the faint flare at the corner of his nostrils. Jasmine slid the letter a few inches closer to the microphones so that its presence became auditory. Paper against wood, an unremarkable sound made remarkable by the silence around it. She let the moment stretch, then reached into the envelope again and drew out a second item, a small Polaroid photograph. The edges were bent, the image slightly faded, but clear enough. Epstein, bare-chested in a dimly lit room, standing beside a taller man whose face lingered just inside the shadow line. She flipped it over, revealing a single word written in the same thin, uneven hand as the letter leverage. The committee didn't move. The gallery didn't breathe. Jasmine placed the photograph beside the letter without comment, because none was needed. The juxtaposition told its own story, a story that ran parallel to the word insurance, like 2 tracks leading to the same destination. "This," she said quietly, "is what buried truth looks like. Not in flames, in silence, in shadows." She leaned back slightly, letting the camera pull the frame wide again so viewers at home could see both items in the same shot. In the far corner of the room, a reporter's pen fell to the floor with a sharp, unguarded clatter. Trump shifted again, leaning toward one of his lawyers who bent to listen. But whatever words passed between them didn't reach the microphones this time. Jasmine's eyes tracked the movement, not with triumph, but with the patience of someone who understood that the first crack in a wall was never the last. She reached for the evidence sleeve at her side, slid the letter and the photograph inside, and sealed it with a single definitive press. Her voice, when it came again, was almost conversational, which somehow made it more dangerous. "I prepare," she repeated, the echo of her earlier words now reinforced by what she laid out before them. And the only people who fear preparation, her eyes swept the panel, then landed once more on Trump, are the ones who've built something that can't withstand it. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was its own verdict, a silence threaded with realization. They were no longer just hearing testimony. They were watching the scaffolding of an empire tremble, knowing that once it started to fall, nothing inside these walls could hold it up again. The letter remained between them, but now every eye in the room had zeroed in on the top right corner of the page. There, in cramped, almost hesitant handwriting, was a single word that didn't belong to the careful structure of the rest of the text. Insurance. It was smaller than the other lines, slanted as though it had been squeezed in after the fact, an afterthought meant for the right eyes and a warning meant for the wrong ones. Trump's gaze flicked to it, just for an instant, and that was all the cameras needed. Under the merciless glare of the lights, a bead of sweat began its slow descent from his temple, winding its way along the edge of his cheek before disappearing into the sharp crease beside his mouth. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't have to be. In a room this charged, that single drop was enough to shift the temperature. It spoke without words. He'd seen the term before, and he knew exactly who it was meant for. In the press gallery, a Fox News anchor, lips parted slightly, murmured almost inaudibly, "Oh my God." The phrase wasn't commentary, it was recognition, like hearing the opening note of a song you wish you could forget. Her co-anchor leaned in, as if confirming she'd seen the same thing. Neither of them looked away from the paper. Jasmine Crockett didn't hurry. She stood over the table, her fingertips lightly brushing the edge of the letter as if she might draw power from it. Her voice, when it came, was calm, almost conversational, which somehow made the words land harder. "He didn't write this to save himself," she said, letting the statement hang just long enough for the room to inhale. Then, with a quiet that cut sharper than any shout, "He wrote it to bury someone else." It was like hammering a nail into marble. No give, no wobble, just impact. Each word drove deeper into the collective stillness, sealing the point in place. Somewhere behind her, a chair creaked as one of the junior staffers shifted uncomfortably. Across the aisle, a senator folded his arms tighter, as though bracing himself against a gust of wind. Trump didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the page, but not in the way a curious man might study evidence. This was a locked stare, the kind of focus you get when you've spent years controlling which parts of a story survive, and you're now watching the wrong part surface. Jasmine glanced at the panel, scanning each face as though cataloging their reactions. Some were trying to keep their expressions neutral, others had already given themselves away. The chairman's pen, which had been tapping absently earlier, was now still in his hand. Even the gallery had gone quiet, their usual rustle replaced by a collective lean forward. She reached for the document again, sliding it just a little closer to her side of the table. It was a subtle move, but deliberate, a reminder that she was in possession of it, not merely displaying it. "This word," she continued, her fingertip tapping lightly on the corner, "is not a metaphor. In Epstein's own handwriting, it was a designation, a marker, a signal to anyone who knew the game. He was holding a piece meant to protect him or destroy someone else." Trump's right index finger twitched against the wood of the table. He blinked twice, slow, as if buying himself a moment before the next blow. The lights caught the sheen along his hairline now, the beginnings of another drop forming. His attorney on the right shifted in her chair, but didn't lean in this time, perhaps sensing that any movement would draw attention to the wrong moment. "Insurance," Jasmine repeated softly, almost as if testing the sound of it in the room. "That's the kind of word you use when you know your life could end without warning. When you've seen people disappear, not just from headlines, but from history." She let the weight of the line settle. "And you don't write it down unless you've already decided who you'd use it against." The hum of the air conditioning seemed louder now. No one spoke. No one coughed. Even the press photographers had stopped snapping for a moment, unwilling to risk breaking the spell. Jasmine shifted her gaze back to Trump, and the silence became a weapon. "You know why that word's there," she said, not as a question, but as an assertion. "You know what it meant to him, and you know who it was meant for." He didn't answer. He didn't shake his head or offer a dismissive scoff. He simply held her stare, the muscle in his jaw flexing once. For the cameras, it was the kind of stillness that demanded replay, frame by frame. Finally, Jasmine stepped back, but not as retreat, more like an executioner stepping away from the block after the blade had dropped. She gathered the letter into a clear evidence sleeve, her motions precise, sealing it with a single press of her thumb. The sleeve's plastic crinkled, the sound oddly sharp in the heavy air. "This was recovered from a secure locker inside MCC," she said, her tone still level, but her pacing slowing deliberately. "Dated 14 hours before Epstein's death. It was never logged into evidence. It was never supposed to surface." She looked down at the sleeve in her hand. "And yet, here we are." Outside the chamber, the crowd's noise swelled faintly, still distant but insistent, a reminder that this was unfolding in real time for a nation watching. Inside, Trump sat back slightly, not in comfort, but in a measured recalibration, like a man adjusting his stance before the next wave hit. The first drop of sweat had vanished, but the market left, in the room, in the perception of everyone watching, remained. Jasmine didn't need to press the point further in that moment. The word had done its work. It was no longer just ink on paper. It was an echo, bouncing off every wall in the chamber, refusing to fade. And for the first time, the man in the red tie wasn't dictating the terms of the story. The power in the room had shifted, quietly but so completely that even the walls seemed to register it. Jasmine let that moment breathe for a heartbeat longer, then slid her hand back into the yellowed envelope. The gesture was calm, unhurried, but there was a precision to it, as if she already knew exactly what her fingertips would find, and what it would do to the air in this chamber when she placed it in plain sight. She drew out a small, square Polaroid, the kind that didn't belong in official evidence because it looked too personal, too raw, too immediate. The glossy surface caught the overhead light for a split second before she tilted it forward, revealing the image. Epstein was unmistakable even without the tailored suits or smug grin the public had come to know. Shirtless, skin pale under the dim glow of a single overhead bulb, the angles of his body sharp as if carved from bone and shadow. Beside him stood a taller man, his features swallowed in the dark line of the frame, the light never quite reaching his face, but it didn't need to. The proportions, the stance, the way one hand hovered too deliberately near the small of Epstein's back, it all whispered recognition without offering the safety of outright identification. No one spoke. The silence was a living thing now, expanding to fill every corner. Jasmine turned the photograph over in her hand. On the back, in the same uneven handwriting as the letter, one word had been scrawled: leverage. The ink was slightly smudged, as though the writer had pressed too hard or written too quickly, but the intent was intact. It was not a caption, it was a label, a purpose. She didn't offer commentary. She didn't need to. Instead, she set the Polaroid down beside the letter, aligning their edges with a precision that made the two artifacts feel like a matched set. Together, they formed a narrative without a single sentence spoken, a letter labeled insurance and a photograph labeled leverage. The implication was almost too perfect, too damning to be accidental. From the press gallery, a camera clicked, then another, rapid fire. Across the table, Trump's eyes darted briefly to the photograph before snapping back to Jasmine, but the cameras caught the flicker. It was enough to suggest recognition, or at least discomfort. A muscle in his jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin, controlled line. Jasmine finally spoke, her tone softer than before, almost as if she were confiding something rather than presenting it. "This is what buried truth looks like," she said, pausing just long enough for the weight of the phrase to sink in. "Not in flames, in silence, in shadows." She let her gaze move from the panel to the cameras, ensuring that the millions watching at home could feel as though she was speaking directly to them. A cough came from the back row, quickly stifled. Someone shifted in their seat, the sound of fabric brushing against wood suddenly amplified in the stillness. It wasn't just that the room was quiet, it was that no one wanted to be the one to break it. Trump leaned toward one of his lawyers, muttering something low enough that only the person beside him could hear. But the body language betrayed him. The slight forward hunch, the way his hand moved to cover his mouth as if shielding the words from being read rather than heard. Jasmine watched him without turning her head, her peripheral awareness razor sharp. She stepped back from the table just slightly, enough to force the committee members to lean forward if they wanted to keep her fully in view. "These two items," she continued, gesturing to the letter in the photograph, "were never meant to be together in this room. One was locked away in a federal facility's secure locker, marked for eyes that never came. The other was found in a personal safe, inside a property that was never listed in Epstein's official holdings." She let the facts land one by one, each like a slow drop of water on stone. They came from different places, but they point to the same thing. Trump shifted in his seat, the leather creaking faintly beneath him. Outside the chamber, the low rumble of the crowd gathered beyond the barricades grew just enough to bleed into the room, a reminder that the world beyond these walls was listening, waiting, ready to decide what it believed. Jasmine looked down at the word on the back of the Polaroid again, leverage, as if weighing it in her mind. When a man like Jeffrey Epstein writes insurance, and when he labels a photograph leverage, it's not random, it's not sentimental, it's transactional, it's survival. She lifted her eyes to Trump. "And it's aimed at someone who has something to lose." Her words hung in the air, heavier than the evidence itself. The panel members shifted in their seats, a few glancing toward the chairman, but he said nothing. The rules of decorum seemed irrelevant now. The hearing had crossed into territory where procedure could not contain the weight of what was unfolding. Jasmine slid the photograph into its own protective sleeve, sealing it with the same deliberate press she'd used for the letter. The twin artifacts now lay side by side, encased in clear plastic like exhibits in a museum of power and its inevitable decay. "These are not just objects," she said quietly. "They are the story behind the story, and you can decide to ignore them, but you can't pretend they don't exist." Trump's gaze dropped briefly to the table, then back to her. His eyes were darker now, less defiant and more guarded, as though recalculating in real time. For the cameras, it was a small moment. But in the language of power, it was monumental, a sign that control was no longer absolute. The room remained in its suspended state, caught between revelation and the fear of what might come next. And in that fragile stillness, Jasmine Crockett stood like a fulcrum, holding the balance of a story that could tip in any direction, knowing full well that once it moved, nothing could stop the fall. She let the silence stretch just a little further, her hand hovering over the envelope, like a gambler with one card left to play. When she finally reached inside again, it wasn't for another photograph or a handwritten letter. This time, what emerged was thinner, cleaner, colder, an official log sheet, its header stamped with the insignia of the Metropolitan Correctional Center. She slid it across the polished wood toward the committee, the faint rasp of paper on table loud in the hush. The date at the top read July 23rd, the ink crisp and black, unblinking. Her fingertip moved down the column of names and times until it stopped. Dead center. "Line 14, she said softly, though her voice carried to every corner of the chamber. The panel members leaned forward in near unison. There it was in neat block type, 02:41 a.m., Michael Cohen. The notation was precise, private elevator access, service lift, and in the remarks column, a short string of words that seemed almost deliberately antiseptic. Special clearance. Escort declined. Jasmine let them read it before she spoke again. "No guards," she said evenly. "No official cameras. No log from the primary security feed. Just this." She tapped the paper once, a single, deliberate gesture. Less than 24 hours before Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell. The reaction was instantaneous, if muted. One of the committee members exhaled sharply through his nose. The Fox News anchor in the gallery leaned forward so far her blazer bunched at the shoulders. Somewhere in the back, a pen clattered to the floor and rolled, unclaimed, until it stopped against a chair leg. Trump didn't move at first. Then slowly, he shifted his right hand from the table to his lap, as though removing it from the frame of the cameras. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in the tight focus of someone calculating which story would survive this detail. Jasmine straightened, letting the log remain in the center of the table where all could see it. For those who've forgotten, she continued, Michael Cohen wasn't just any visitor. He was, for more than a decade, Donald Trump's personal attorney, his fixer. The man who handled the mess before it became a headline. Her tone never rose, but the syllables carried an edge, each one deliberate. And here he was, in the Metropolitan Correctional Center, at 2:41 in the morning, through a service elevator, while Jeffrey Epstein was still alive. The words "still alive" landed with a dull thud in the room, and the pause that followed was heavier than anything she'd said yet. One of Trump's lawyers leaned toward him, whispering quickly. He didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the log, but his jaw was set in that rigid, locked position that said more than any denial could. The sweat from earlier hadn't returned, but the stillness in his shoulders carried its own kind of tension, as if any movement might trigger an avalanche he wasn't ready to face. Jasmine moved to the edge of the table, resting her hand lightly on the log without obscuring the text. Service elevator access means no standard surveillance, no uniformed escort, no record on the public-facing entry logs. She looked directly at the panel. You'd have an easier time tracing the delivery of a pizza to MCC that night than tracing this visit. The line drew no laughter, only the tightening of expressions around the room. One senator glanced toward the press section, as though weighing the optics of being seen with his reaction written on his face. From outside, a faint rumble of chants began to seep into the chamber. It was indistinct, just the throb of a crowd's rhythm, but it was there, a reminder that this story wasn't contained to these four walls. Jasmine ignored it for now. Her attention was fixed squarely on the man in the red tie. You want to tell me this was coincidence? She asked, not sharply, but with the dangerous calm of someone already certain of the answer. That a man who handled your dirtiest work just happened to be in the same facility, in the same 24-hour window, with a man who had the power to ruin you both? Trump finally broke his stillness, leaning forward just slightly, his eyes narrowing. But before he could speak, Jasmine lifted the log and slid it into a transparent evidence sleeve, sealing it with that same precise motion she'd used before. The plastic crinkled, a sound that was fast becoming the auditory metronome of this hearing. She set the sealed log down beside the letter and the photograph. 3 artifacts now, each different, each damning, together forming a story that didn't need embellishment. Insurance, she said, pointing to the letter. Leverage, to the photograph. And now, access. Her hand hovered over the trio like a dealer revealing a final card. The chain isn't complicated. It's only as long as it needs to be to hang someone. The phrase hit the room with a quiet, lethal precision. No one moved to object. No one dared to break the rhythm she'd built. Trump sat back, his chin lifting slightly, but his eyes were darker now, less certain. The man who had spent his life dictating the terms of every fight was watching the terrain shift under him. And for the first time, the ground wasn't his. And somewhere in the distance, beneath the chants outside and the cameras inside, the faintest creak of that scaffolding could be heard again. Then, without warning, the overhead lights cut out, not to darkness, but to the cold blue glow of a projector. The marble chamber shifted into a theater of shadows, every face drawn toward the wall where the first grainy frame appeared. It wasn't from any feed the public had seen before. The timestamp in the corner was unfamiliar, the angle was wrong, and the corridor it captured didn't match any known floor plan of the Metropolitan Correctional Center. This was no public hallway. It was a vein buried deep inside the concrete body of the prison, unmarked, undocumented, a place that existed only for those who knew where to find it. The camera, mounted high and tucked into a shadowed recess, offered a view down its length. The walls were raw concrete, the kind that sweated in summer and froze in winter. Overhead, a single strip of fluorescent lighting flickered like a dying heartbeat. The silence in the chamber now was not just attention. It was the heavy stillness of people realizing they were seeing something they were never meant to see. Jasmine stood at the center of it all, not speaking yet. She let the image hold, let the audience feel the claustrophobia of that narrow corridor. Then in the distance, a movement, just a suggestion at first, a distortion in the static. Slowly, a figure emerged from the far end, head lowered, the brim of a baseball cap pulled so far down it seemed to slice the face in half. They didn't run. That was the part that made the room lean in closer. Whoever it was moved with measured urgency, a pace just shy of panic, as if they knew the camera was there but believed speed would only draw attention. Still, there was an unmistakable hitch in their step, enough to betray the adrenaline threading through every stride. The shadow passed under the single light, and for a fraction of a second, the shape of the jaw, the angle of the shoulders became visible. Not enough for absolute certainty, but enough for anyone familiar to feel the gut punch of recognition. Jasmine pressed a button on the remote in her hand, freezing the frame. The ghostly figure stood suspended mid-stride, one arm swinging slightly back, the hand pale in the artificial light. "This corridor," she began, her voice low, steady, "does not exist on the official schematics for MCC. It doesn't appear in inspection reports, and yet this footage was recorded at 2:44 a.m. July 23rd, exactly 3 minutes after Michael Cohen entered the building. The timestamp in the upper right corner blinked faintly, proof in digits. The connection was a steel wire, thin but strong enough to carry the weight of implication. Trump's gaze flicked to the screen, then back to Jasmine. But there was something tighter in his posture now, a defense mechanism honed over decades, struggling to mask the fracture lines. "This is a service corridor used only for 3 things," Jasmine continued. "Prisoner transfers without public record, deliveries the Bureau of Prisons doesn't log, and visits that no one intends to leave on paper." She let the words settle, the silence afterward almost accusatory. Someone in the press pool shifted, a leather notebook creaking under the grip of a hand that was suddenly too tight. The air in the room felt heavier, as though the oxygen itself had thickened with the weight of what was being seen. The footage resumed. The figure moved past the camera's blind spot, disappearing into the far darkness. Jasmine let the feed roll for another 10 seconds, the screen showing only empty corridor again. Then it went black. "That," she said, "is the last visual record of this person before Epstein's death. No exit footage, no trace on the main security network, no mention in any log except the one I just placed on this table." Her hand hovered over the sealed visitor log like she was tracing a map between 2 points. The chairman shifted in his seat, his voice low but carrying. "Do you know who that is, Representative Crockett?" Jasmine's gaze never left Trump. "I know who they were meeting," she replied. That landed harder than any direct accusation could have. It made the silence stretch again, but now it wasn't empty. It was crowded, dense with unspoken conclusions. In the gallery, a murmur rose and was quickly smothered. Outside, the chants had grown louder, but here inside, it was as if the sound was coming from another universe. Every eye was locked on the man in the red tie, and for the first time in his public life, his silence was louder than his words. Jasmine didn't press the advantage immediately. She let the moment stand. Let the viewers at home sit with the image of that corridor, that figure, that timestamp. Then she leaned forward slightly, resting her fingertips on the table. "Concrete doesn't lie. Cameras don't imagine. And shadows. Shadows only exist when there's something real to block the light." Trump's jaw twitched. The scaffolding creaked again. And somewhere, deep inside the machinery of his carefully built image, another bolt came loose. The sound came first, a soft shift of air as the chamber doors swung open. Every head turned. A young woman stepped through, her movements unhurried but deliberate, like someone who had walked through worse rooms than this. She wore a gray coat that fell to her knees, the kind that belonged to neither season nor fashion, and it swallowed her frame. There was no press badge around her neck, no committee-issued credentials clipped to her lapel. Just her, the coat, and the heavy silence that followed her in. 2 security officers instinctively moved to intercept, but Jasmine raised her hand without looking away from the newcomer. "She's expected," Jasmine said, her voice carrying across the chamber with the weight of pre-cleared authority. The officers hesitated, then stepped back. The woman stopped at the center of the aisle, her eyes sweeping the room once. Not searching, not lost, but taking its measure. Then she spoke. "My name is Witness 22, she said. No preamble, No apology, just the title, like it was the only identity she had left. Her voice was calm, stripped of drama, but it landed with the gravity of something sharpened in the dark. The room stilled further. The number alone carried its own mystery. There had been talk in sealed briefings about a series of protected witnesses in the Epstein investigation, each assigned a number to mask their name. None had been seen in public. Until now. I saw Donald Trump, she continued, and her gaze shifted until it found him across the chamber. On that island. No embellishment, no hesitation, but the effect was immediate, a detonation without sound. The words hit the room like a match into a vat of gasoline, igniting every unspoken suspicion. A low murmur rippled through the gallery, but it died quickly under the weight of the cameras pivoting toward her. Trump's head lifted, eyes narrowing, a performance-ready denial forming in the lines of his mouth. But something about her tone made it falter before it began. This wasn't the trembling outrage of an accuser looking for a spotlight. This was the steadiness of someone who had been waiting for the exact moment to speak. Jasmine leaned back slightly, her hands folded, letting the weight of the statement hang. She didn't interrupt. She knew better than to cut into a silence that was doing more damage than any question could. Witness 22 stepped forward, each footfall measured, the sound of her boots soft against the marble. I was there because I was taken there, she said. I was 17. I didn't know where I was until the boat left. Her eyes never left Trump's. He was there. I saw him. I remember the way he laughed when Epstein whispered in his ear. In the gallery, someone inhaled sharply enough for the microphone nearest them to catch it. On the dais, a senator shifted uncomfortably, his pen stilled in his hand. Trump's fingers tapped once against the table, then stopped. He didn't look away, but the tightening around his mouth betrayed the calculation in his head. Discredit, dismiss, distract. The usual tools, but here, under this light, with this voice, they felt heavier to lift. The woman's gaze sharpened. You can say I'm lying. You can say I'm mistaken, but you can't erase me. You tried, and you failed. I am here. The last three words didn't rise in volume, but they struck with a finality that cut through the air. Jasmine finally leaned forward, her tone quiet but caring. Do you have evidence to support your account? The woman reached into her coat. For a split second, the security detail tensed, but she withdrew only a small, weathered envelope. She held it up so the cameras could see before crossing the last few steps to hand it directly to Jasmine. Inside, the paper was brittle, sun-bleached at the edges. A photograph. It was shot from a distance, grainy but unmistakable. The curve of a shoreline, the flash of water against a dock. And on it, a tall man in a light-colored suit standing beside Epstein. His head was turned just enough to catch the light, just enough to make denial a dangerous choice. The gallery didn't breathe. Jasmine slid the photograph onto the table beside the other pieces. Insurance, leverage, access, and now a face on an island no one was supposed to remember. Trump's eyes flicked to it and away again, faster this time, as though the act of looking gave it power. Witness 22 stepped back, her role complete, but her presence still thick in the air. That's all, she said, and yet everyone in the room knew it wasn't, that what she'd brought was the start of something larger, something that would unravel whether or not they wanted it to. Jasmine inclined her head slightly in thanks, then turned her attention back to the committee. The record will reflect the entry of Exhibit 4. She didn't need to say what everyone already knew. This wasn't just an exhibit, it was another crack in the scaffolding. Trump's hands clasped in front of him, the knuckles whitening. The chants outside grew louder, sharper, like they'd somehow heard what had just been said. And deep in the foundations of the room, another bolt gave way. The young woman, witness 22, did not leave. Instead, she reached once more into that gray coat, fingers drawing out a large sheet of paper wrapped in waxy brown parchment. She handled it with the care of someone holding something both fragile and dangerous. Without a word, she stepped toward Jasmine and placed it on the table between them. Jasmine unfolded it slowly. The paper inside was coarse, yellowed at the edges, the grain visible under the chamber lights. Charcoal lines swept across it, bold in some places, faint in others, shaping the outline of a man. The details came into focus one by one. The sweep of hair rendered in sharp, deliberate strokes. The unmistakable curve of a long tie, shaded to a deep, deliberate red. The rigid set of shoulders. The glint of light caught in the sweep of a chandelier above his head. No one needed to be told who it was. The room seemed to tilt toward it as the figure emerged from the charcoal haze. The man in the drawing wasn't smiling. He was looking down, caught in a moment that felt both mundane and sinister, as if the artist had caught him mid-thought, unguarded. Jasmine's fingers lingered at the bottom corner, where a small, neat notation read, age 15. Her voice when it came was quiet, but carried through the stillness like a thread through cloth. She drew this when she was 15 years old. The committee members leaned forward. The audience in the gallery froze. Jasmine reached to her side and an aide stepped forward with a glossy photograph encased in clear archival plastic. She set it beside the drawing. It was a photograph of the grand ballroom at Mar-a-Lago, the chandeliers massive and ornate, every facet catching the light in the same fractured way the charcoal had captured. The arched molding on the walls, the checkerboard marble floor, each element in the photo mirrored exactly in the drawing. Even the posture of the man, the tilt of his head beneath that chandelier, was identical. Jasmine didn't speak at first. She let the parallel burn its way into the retinas of every person in the room. Two images, separated by time and medium, but bound by the same reality. One was a memory etched by the hand of a teenager. The other was the cold, indisputable eye of a camera. This, she said finally, tapping the drawing, was her way of not forgetting, because she knew there would come a time when someone would tell her she imagined it, that it didn't happen, that she was mistaken. Her finger slid to the photograph. And this is the room, this is the man, this is the moment. Trump's eyes flicked to the drawing and then away, faster than before, but not before the cameras caught the movement. It was the kind of look a man gives when confronted with something so specific, so anchored in reality, that to deny it outright feels like stepping into quicksand. The gallery was silent, but the tension felt like static on the skin. Someone near the back cleared their throat and then seemed to regret making a sound. Jasmine leaned back slightly, letting her words find their own weight. We talk about testimony as if it lives only in spoken words. But trauma doesn't always speak in straight lines. Sometimes it draws. Sometimes it sketches what the mouth can't yet name. The young woman's hands were clasped in front of her now, her gaze steady on the committee. I kept it hidden, she said softly, because I thought no one would believe a girl's drawing. But I learned that paper doesn't forget. And neither do I. The committee chair shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his notes, but the air in the room had shifted entirely. This wasn't abstract accusation anymore. It was tangible. It had edges, shadows, and light, just like the room where it had happened. Jasmine didn't push further, not yet. She simply gathered the drawing and the photograph, sliding them into a clear protective sleeve before laying them in front of her like evidence ready to be entered into record. Exhibit 5, she said, her voice almost casual, but the words landed like a door locking shut. Outside, the chants rose again, as though the crowd could feel the weight of what had just been laid bare. Inside, Trump's jaw clenched harder, the muscles flickering under his skin. The scaffolding creaked, louder now, and somewhere in the architecture of his carefully managed persona, another piece gave way. Jasmine looked down at the drawing once more before meeting his eyes. You can't erase what someone sees, she said, especially when they've already put it on paper. The camera zoomed in on the match between the charcoal chandelier and the crystal one in the photograph, broadcasting the pairing to millions of viewers at home. In living rooms across the country, people leaned closer to their screens, the image burning itself into their minds. Trump shifted in his chair, fingers curling against the tabletop, but the drawing remained where it was, an unmoving anchor in a room where everything else was starting to tilt. And in that silence, the sound of the scaffolding groaning again was almost deafening. Then, without warning, the screens lining the committee chamber flickered to life. A grainy, high-contrast security feed appeared. The timestamp in the upper right corner read 02 and 1347, the date stamped only days before Epstein's death. The header in the corner identified the location, MCC, Restricted Legal Access Wing. The footage showed a narrow corridor, its cinder block walls painted the color of old ash. The camera angle was fixed, and yet the moment felt alive, dangerous. From the left edge of the frame, Ghislaine Maxwell entered. She was moving fast, not a run, but the kind of pace reserved for meetings that couldn't wait. Her hair was pulled tight, her face obscured partly by shadow. From the opposite end came a man in a navy suit, tall, purposeful. He carried no briefcase, no phone in hand, but his right arm was bent, holding something small and rectangular against his side. The two stopped halfway down the corridor. There were no guards in sight. Maxwell stepped closer, her head tilting just enough for the camera to catch the flicker of recognition between them. The man handed her the item, folded, thick, the edges worn. A document. She took it without question, tucking it inside her jacket before leaning in to say something the camera could not hear. Jasmine's voice, low but clear, cut through the silence. "You're looking at footage from a zone no civilian should ever enter without clearance. And yet, here we are." She nodded toward the bottom of the screen, where a faint text overlay scrolled by. "Internal positioning data pulled from the MCC wireless network." A second window appeared on the monitor. A map of the restricted wing, overlaid with a single blinking dot labeled Device Trumporg 17. The path traced matched perfectly with the man's movement in the footage. Jasmine didn't give the room time to breathe. "This," she said, pointing with a pen, "is metadata from the device in his pocket, a device registered to the internal network of the Trump organization, logged in under a user who, curiously, has no legal role in MCC operations." The man in the navy suit shifted on the screen, and that's when the camera caught it. Just as he extended his hand to take Maxwell's in a brief shake, the cuff of his sleeve lifted. The light from a fixture above hit the cufflink on his wrist, a flash of silver and enamel. Jasmine clicked a button. A new image appeared beside the video, a high-resolution photograph taken 3 days earlier of Donald Trump stepping out of a black SUV. His arm was mid-wave, his suit navy, his cufflink catching the light in exactly the same way. The design, blue enamel encircled in polished silver, was identical. No one in the room spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the monitors. 3 days before this meeting, Jasmine said, this man wore those cufflinks on a public sidewalk in front of the press. And yet here, she tapped the pause frame of the video, the same cufflinks appear in a restricted hallway of MCC, being used to hand Ghislaine Maxwell a document no one on record can account for. Trump's face was still, but the tension in his jawline betrayed the churn beneath the surface. Jasmine's pen tapped once against the tabletop. "This is not rumor. This is not hearsay. This is visual confirmation, metadata verification, and time-location match. You can argue about context. You cannot argue about presence." The footage played again, slower this time. The camera holding on the exchange like an unblinking witness. The document passing from hand to hand, the slight nod from Maxwell, the way the man glanced briefly up the hall toward the camera and kept walking. The gallery leaned forward in unison, as if pulled by a single thread. Jasmine leaned back, letting the moment breathe, but her eyes never left Trump's. "When people talk about locked doors, Mr. Trump," she said, her tone like a blade laid gently on a table, "they forget that cameras sometimes fit through the keyhole." The feed cut to black. The room remained frozen, caught between the silence of revelation and the noise waiting to erupt outside. And then, almost imperceptibly, the scaffolding groaned again. Jasmine's hand moved slowly, deliberately toward a slim plastic sleeve on her desk. It was no larger than a folded napkin, but the way she held it, between thumb and forefinger, as though it were both delicate and explosive, made the entire chamber lean forward without thinking. She nodded to the tech crew. The screens behind her lit up once more, not with video this time, but with a scan of a piece of paper, torn along the edges, smudged at the corners as if it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. 4 lines handwritten in blue ink, uneven and slanted. The script was instantly recognizable to anyone who had seen the trial exhibits from the Maxwell case. "He promised he'd save me, said he'd done it before." I stayed silent. "Where is he now?" The ink was slightly blurred in places, like the writer's hand had hesitated or trembled before setting the pen down. No name, no signature. But in the stillness that followed, every pair of eyes in the room shifted toward the same spot, the man in the red tie. Jasmine didn't speak immediately. She let the 4 lines breathe, let them seep into the marrow of the chamber. Then quietly she said, "This was written inside MCC, in the women's restricted holding area, smuggled out, and intercepted before it could be destroyed." She reached for a remote and tapped a button. From the speakers, an audio file crackled to life. Old, grainy, but unmistakable. The date stamp read July 2016. A man's voice, rich with the confidence of someone unused to consequence, filled the room. "Some people are just too valuable to jail." The words hung there, their weight measured not in decibels but in the shift of posture around the chamber. Committee members straightened. The gallery stiffened. Even the court stenographer paused mid-keystroke, fingers hovering. Jasmine let the audio play again, the phrase repeating like a refrain you couldn't get out of your head. On the 3rd loop, she spoke over it, her voice steady. "Ghislaine Maxwell wrote those words. He promised he'd save me, while sitting behind bars, knowing she was running out of options. And this," she gestured toward the speakers, "is Donald Trump, the same year telling an audience what he thought of accountability." Trump's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed somewhere just above the monitors, as if refusing to meet the ink on that page. But the cuff of his sleeve twitched. "This is not a coincidence," Jasmine continued. "This is a promise that bought silence, a promise made to someone who knew where the bodies were buried, perhaps literally." She stepped toward the screen, her heels clicking against the marble in a slow, deliberate rhythm. And when she asked, "Where is he now?" she wasn't asking because she didn't know. She was asking because she understood. Promises made in the shadows are only good until the light hits them. The note remained on the screen, the handwriting filling the space between them like a ghost refusing to leave. Jasmine lowered her voice. This wasn't just a cry for help. It was an indictment, written by someone who had already lived in the deep end of power's pool and was now drowning in its undertow. The committee chair shifted, clearing his throat, but said nothing. The air felt thick, the kind of stillness that comes right before a storm breaks. Jasmine placed the plastic sleeve flat on the table in front of her, as though laying down a card in a game everyone suddenly realized was for keeps. "We can debate policy all day," she said. "We can split hairs about procedure. But what we cannot do, what we will not do, is pretend that the silence of the powerful is anything but deliberate and paid for." Outside, the chant swelled, echoing up the stone steps and through the doors. Inside, the 4 lines of handwriting burned into the consciousness of everyone present, a reminder that sometimes the loudest testimony is written in ink that never expected to see daylight. The scaffolding groaned again, louder this time, and in that sound was the whisper of something inevitable, coming closer. Donald Trump rose from his seat and walked to the witness table. The red tie was still knotted perfectly, the jacket pressed, the hair carefully arranged, but the hand he placed on the edge of the desk betrayed him. It trembled, just enough for the microphones to pick up the faint tap of his fingernail against the wood. The oath was administered in the same flat monotone as every other witness before him, but in this room, in this moment, it sounded almost ceremonial, like the opening bars of a funeral march. He raised his right hand, palm out, and for a fraction of a second, the lighting caught the cufflinks again. The same ones from the Maxwell footage. The same ones from 3 days before the hallway meeting. He sat. His chair let out a quiet creak that, to those listening closely, might as well have been another bolt giving way. Jasmine Crockett didn't waste her breath on introductions. She didn't lean forward. She didn't smile. "Mr. Trump," she began, her tone as even as the horizon before a storm, "do you deny ever calling Jeffrey Epstein your insurance?" Trump's mouth moved, but the first syllable was caught in his throat. He adjusted the microphone, leaned forward and said, "I don't recall ever using that word in—" "Not what I asked." Jasmine's voice cut in before the sentence could finish, sharp enough to draw a few gasps from the gallery. "Do you deny it?" Trump blinked. Look, Epstein was someone I knew, like many people knew him. Jasmine's hand moved, and the yellowed envelope appeared again, sliding across the polished wood toward him. She opened the flap and withdrew the folded sheet, the same 4 lines of Maxwell's handwriting they had all seen moments ago. Without unfolding it, she placed it squarely in front of him. "You don't have to read it," she said, her voice dropping lower, heavier. "You've already heard it. You know what it says." She tapped it once with her index finger. "She believed you'd save her because you told her you would." Trump's jaw clenched, but his gaze didn't drop to the paper. Jasmine's next words were slower, colder, like each one had been sharpened before it left her mouth. And then she wrote that if he, she tilted her head just slightly, if you spoke, you would turn her into a ghost. There was no ripple of noise in the chamber this time. No murmurs, no gasps, only silence. But it was not an empty silence. It was thick, coiled, almost viscous. The kind of silence that presses on the ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. Trump's lips parted as if to speak, but whatever line he had prepared seemed to crumble before it reached daylight. His eyes flicked, just once, toward the exit at the far end of the room. Jasmine didn't move. "You've built an empire on the belief that silence can be bought, that the powerful decide who gets to remain visible and who disappears. But today," she leaned forward, her voice almost a whisper now, the kind that somehow carries further than a shout, "your power has nowhere left to hide." The letter between them lay still. The ink on it might as well have been fresh, because its weight was pressing into the present, demanding to be answered. Trump's hands clasped together on the table, knuckles whitening. For the first time all morning, he wasn't the one steering the narrative. He was simply in it. And the scaffolding, whatever it had been holding up, gave one final resounding groan. In that moment, the veneer cracked. Not loudly, not in an explosion of noise, but in the slow, almost surgical peeling away of control. You could see it in his posture, in the way his shoulders sagged a fraction of an inch, in the way his gaze no longer swept the room, but locked on the single piece of paper that might outlive him. Outside, the chants roared. Inside, the silence held. It was not the silence of confusion or indecision. It was the silence that comes when power realizes the runway has ended and there is no place left to land. When the last word is spoken and the echoes fade, what remains is not the scandal, nor the spectacle, but the truth that survived them both. Power may build walls of fear, but sooner or later, someone will walk through the door carrying nothing but courage and a reason to speak. And in that moment, the choice belongs to all of us. Whether we turn away or stand long enough to see that justice isn't an institution, it's a decision we make together every time we refuse to let silence win. If this story struck a chord, don't just move on, sit with it, let it challenge you. Let it remind you that silence is a choice, and so is speaking. Like, comment, and share it with someone who still believes the truth has a place in the light. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where every shadow gets a name. Hit the bell, because the next chapter isn't comfortable. It's unfiltered, and it might just change how you measure power. This is a fictional dramatization, born from the echoes of real injustices and real acts of courage. Any likeness to actual people or events is either coincidental or intentional, as a mirror for public reflection. Thank you for watching. Justice isn't gifted, it's claimed. This is Harrison Stories.